Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most famous history books ever written, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. We're going to pull out the incredible story of a so-called barbarian king who gave Rome one last, shining, golden age, only to fall into his own tragic darkness.
So here's the big question, right? Could an outsider, a barbarian, actually rule Rome better than the Romans themselves? That was the question hanging over the entire reign of Theodoric the Goth. And amazingly, for a while, the answer seemed to be a resounding yes. He gave Italy one last taste of real peace and prosperity before things got dark.
All right, so where does our story begin? Well, you might think it's in some muddy, Gothic camp, but no. It starts in the most dazzling, sophisticated city on earth at the time, Constantinople. This is where a young prince named Theodoric was sent as a royal hostage, basically a high-value pawn in the great game between his people and the Eastern Roman Empire. And you can see from his early life, he was basically forged in a really weird, high-stakes environment. He spends 10 years, from age 8 to 18, growing up in the enemy capital. He gets a world-class Roman military education. But here's the thing, he famously wanted nothing to do with all the classical Greek philosophy and literature. He was being molded into a general and a statesman, not a scholar. And this little detail, it just says everything about the guy. According to Gibbon, he was so illiterate that to sign his own name, he had a special gold plate made, a stencil with the first 4 letters of his name cut out so he could trace them. So you've got this political genius, a brilliant military mind, who literally couldn't sign his own name without help. Okay, so Theodoric's been hanging around the Eastern Empire for a while now, sometimes a friend, sometimes a major headache for the Emperor Zeno. So he comes up with this brilliant, audacious plan. He basically tells the emperor, hey, let me take my people, march on Italy, and get rid of the guy ruling there now, Odoacer, all rule in their name. And for Zeno, it was a no-brainer. Get this powerful, unpredictable guy and his entire people out of my territory? Yes, please. Now, you gotta understand, this wasn't just an army on the march. We're talking about an entire nation on the move. Men, women, children, wagons, livestock, the whole shebang. They trekked over 700 miles, fought off other tribes along the way, and after 3 absolutely brutal battles, Theodoric finally cornered Odoacer in the fortress city of Ravenna, and that kicked off a siege that lasted for 3 long years. So after 3 years, the siege finally ends, but not with the big final battle, no. They make a deal. Theodoric and Odoacer agree to rule Italy together. And then, just a few days later, at this huge banquet that's supposed to be a celebration, Theodoric gets up and kills Odoacer with his own sword. Just like that. It's a shocking moment of treachery, and as Gibbon puts it, a really dark stain on his rise to power. So Odoacer's out of the picture. Theodoric is now the king of Italy. But his biggest challenge is just beginning. How on earth do you govern 2 completely different groups of people, your own rough-and-tumble Gothic warriors and the highly civilized, complicated Romans? And his solution, well, it was brilliant, honestly. He basically created 2 separate tracks. The Goths, they were the army. They didn't pay taxes, they held the land, and their only job was to fight and defend the kingdom. The Romans, they kept running everything else. The government, the courts, all the civil stuff. They paid the taxes and lived under their own Roman laws. It was like he used Gothic muscle to protect the state and Roman brains to actually run it. And what happened? It worked. Man, did it work. For 33 years, Italy saw a kind of golden age. I mean, public buildings were being fixed up, ancient monuments were being saved, the roads were safe again, so trade was booming, and he even treated the Roman Senate with total respect. It was a kind of peace and prosperity that people hadn't seen in generations. And this wasn't just policy for him. You get the sense he genuinely loved Roman civilization. He only visited the city of Rome once in his whole reign, for about 6 months. And Gibbon says he just walked around in awe looking at the huge Forum of Trajan. He didn't just gawk at it, either. He put his money where his mouth was, appointing an architect to make sure these incredible buildings were preserved. He really saw himself as Rome's protector.
You knew there was a but coming, right? This whole beautiful golden age, it was resting on a pretty fragile foundation. And the one thing that was going to crack it wide open was religion.
Okay, so here's the deal. Theodoric and his Goths were what's known as Arian Christians. Now, for the Catholic Romans, this was heresy. It was the wrong kind of Christianity. And for most of his rule, Theodoric was incredibly tolerant about it. He didn't care. But as he got older, paranoia started to creep in. He started to worry that his Roman subjects were secretly plotting against him with the emperor back in Constantinople because they were all Catholics. And that creeping paranoia, it needed a target. And it found one, in maybe the most respected man in all of Italy, a senator and philosopher named Boethius. This guy was the real deal, a brilliant scholar, a champion of the Roman people. Basically, the perfect Roman, the exact kind of person Theodoric had built his entire kingdom on. So what happens is another senator gets accused of writing treasonous letters to Constantinople. And Boethius, being the man of principle he was, stands up to defend him. He declares that if just hoping for Roman liberty is a crime, then he and the entire Senate are just as guilty. Now, to Boethius, this was a noble defensive principle, but to the paranoid king, it sounded like a confession.
And just like that, Theodoric threw away decades of his own hard work. Boethius was arrested, accused of not just treason, but sorcery, too, and he was brutally executed without even getting a trial. The man who spent 30 years being the champion of Roman law just tossed it in the trash because he was scared.
So yeah, this brings us to the really messy question of his legacy. How do you even begin to judge a ruler who was both a hero and, well, in the end, a tyrant?
It really is a tale of two different kings, isn't it? On one side, you have the visionary, the guy who brought Italy back from the brink, who upheld the law, who brought decades of peace. But on the other side, you have the paranoid tyrant, the guy who murdered his rival in cold blood, who grew to suspect everyone, and who, in his final years, became a cruel oppressor. He built a magnificent kingdom, but was ultimately consumed by the fear of losing it.
And so, in the end, we're left with this huge, timeless question that Gibbon poses. Was Theodoric a great man who was just corrupted by having too much power for too long? Or was the barbarian, the brutal warrior who killed Odoacer at that dinner party, was he always there, just hiding beneath a civilized surface, waiting to come out? It's a really chilling thought, and one that doesn't just apply to ancient Rome.